I'm Keith Laybourn, Professor Keith Laybourn of the University of Huddersfield. I've written, obviously, a book, Going to the Dogs, which at the time, and I'm not sure of anything since, was the only book that really brought the national picture together. It was a social history of gambling, looking at the infrastructure, what happened, the history, its rise and fall, and basically, how it's organised, the training of dogs, and the whole lot. And the essence of this in terms of community, because it obviously had a community impact in terms of part-time work and local involvement and so forth.
Take us back to 1926. What was Britain like when greyhound racing first arrived?
Well, Britain had just gone through a general strike in 1926. In May 1926, the 3rd of May, a minute to midnight until the 12th. It was an interesting place in terms of things changing. Apart from the general strike, I mean, the BBC became the BBC as we know it, the British Broadcasting Corporation rather than the British Broadcasting Company. At that time, there was, marked poverty, perhaps not as bad as some of the moments in the 30s, but that was more or less the situation. And really, in a sense, from this point of view, one of the things that you've got to realise is that gambling was basically, for the working class, almost illegal, unless you run course. There were two sets of acts in the 1820s, 1850s, and so forth, and 1900. One concerned gaming houses. So if I said I'll have a bet with you on so and so, in the early 20th century, this would make it a gaming house illegal in a pub or whatever. If I went out there and said, well, that's sixpence each way on the Queen's Horse or whatever, that would be illegal because that's street betting. But if you're on track, if you're actually on track, then that's legal. Go to a horse track, it's legal. Go to a bowling green, and it's legal, as long as you're on the area, defined spaces. So for the working class, even though many of them were involved, would go to horse racing, but it's much more a middle class. The working class would use the track that's nearby, rather than traipse around the country, types of word, but rub around the country. And so really, in a sense, working class opportunities for gambling were not there. And there's a very strong anti-gambling movement. People like Seaborn Roundtree set up the National Anti-Gambling League. And that was dedicated to preventing the working class gambling because they can't afford it, it would corrupt women and children, and anyway, it would create a somewhat pronounced society. So that was the sort of viewpoint. And really, they were strongly stopping it. And the religious groups, Quakers, Quadenocker, dissenting groups. I mean, the churches, by and large, non-conformist churches, opposed gambling entirely. The Church of England said, yes, if you can afford it. And the Catholics rabidly gambled. I think that's basically the sort of situation. So, this new opportunity for gambling, because it's on course, is an opportunity that had really never happened before. So from 1926, when the first meeting was held, on the 24th of July at Bellevue, I've got pictures of that meeting, that opens up mass gambling. 1,700 to 2,500 people, attended. Very quickly, it became 2,500 and then 10,000. And in 1926, when nobody was going to the dogs, by 27, everybody's going to the dogs was a hit number in the hit parade. By the early 30s, there's at least 32 million attendances at dog racing, going on for 200 tracks in this country. So, 1926 is a starting point. It's a period, a country in difficulties, there's general strike and so forth, but it's an opportunity for, it provides at that time an opportunity for the extension of the leisure of the working class. been, you know, some people like Winston Churchill, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, referred to these new things as animated roulette wheels. John Buchan, the author, the 39 Steps and others, Green Mantle and other things, he, Lord Tweedsdale later on he was, he talked about illuminated ribbons of turf. You know, he can't have been to a Greyhound meeting because most meetings are not turf.
Given it was so unpopular by the elites, why did it become so popular so quickly? How was it allowed to take off, given that was the environment in which it was born?
Basically, they couldn't stop it, could they? I mean, the point is, it was seen as not being rational recreation. The working class couldn't afford it, that sort of stuff. It didn't matter for the middle class. I mean, I think it was conservative George Curzon, Lord George Curzon, who was he was in line, but Stanley Baldwin beat him to it, to be leader of the Conservative Party from the House of Lords. But Curzon said, you know, the working class shouldn't gamble. But you're a gambler. Yes, but I can afford it. That was the sort of viewpoint.
Well, you paint a really exciting story of the sport being an unstoppable force. But why was it that Manchester was the place where this extraordinary British sporting story began?
It was cheap. You know, it was relatively cheap to get in. You could get a meal relatively cheaply. It was an occasion. And in the early meetings at places like Manchester, there were perhaps 70% perhaps men, young men, whatever, perhaps 30% women and children. Anyway, that was one type of thing. Remember, there's also the flapping tracks, which were not designed for families. They were designed for hardened betters, smaller. Not all smaller, but mostly, you know, if the big tracks were 10,000, they might get 400 or 500 people, regular betters. And in the 30s, of course, there were, and there's not much on these, you can find it. In 1934, the police were allowed to give licenses to tracks of 8 days. We could get a piece of land, divide it up into 8, and put a temporary track up for 8 days in the year. But some of the clever people managed to get around that by dividing the 8s into 8 and getting days of 64 days in the year. But trying to find information on that and other illegal activities is not easy. But going back to Manchester, it was the right place at the right time.
So how did greyhound racing change during and after the Second World War?
Well, let's just think about it. Before the Second World War, greyhound racing took off. Everybody's going to the dogs. They're little bow wows. You go to sit watch the bow wows. And I've got lots of illustrations of that. And it was very popular indeed. But in 1932, in 1929, the tote existed on the racecourses. But in 1929, one or two companies had set up the tote. In fact, most of them by that time had set up, all the big greyhound tracks, and set up the totes. Many tote systems were developed. But then in 1932 it was declared illegal. So for 2 years it was illegal. You could actually organise a greyhound race meeting, but you couldn't bet. Well, that was almost the end of greyhound racing in a sense. And I could tell you about all sorts of ways to get around it, the human tote and all sorts of things, the ways in which they did it. But in 1934, what happened is that greyhound racing became fixed. You could do 104 plus 4 extra, 108 days in the year. So tracks could basically do 2 meetings per week, 108. They said it wouldn't work, but it did, because White City and Manchester, they were making 170,000 a year for the owners. You know, which is, you know, it's like 30 or 40 millions. You know, there's a beautiful quote, you know, King Solomon's mines were never so profitable as greyhound racing. That was the quote they used at the time. And But there were restrictions. They were allowed to continue. The tote was brought back in, and they were allowed to continue. But there were restrictions. There were all sorts of changes, and the sport itself was reduced in many respects. And in fact, actually, there's a lot of opposition, a feeling it should be banned. Stafford Cripps, who was active in the Labour Party and ambassador to Moscow at one time, and then brought back and active in the government of the Second World War, said that in fact greyhound racing should be banned. It's more dangerous than boxing. It's more dangerous than, but because it damages the war production. Well, it's actually not true, because at the end, whilst it's the activity of the working class, only about 4% of the working class actually went to greyhound meetings. It's a niche sport. It's that people go regularly. And so there were restrictions in the Second World War which brought it down. But as soon as it came out, at the end of the war, suddenly it revived again. Now that worried the Attlee government, the Labour government. And what they decided to do was to impose restrictions. Tax, 10% on the tote, 10% on horse racing, 10% on the tote. And then because the bookies could get away with it, they had a tax for the bookies coming in. And that really was the end. So the sport began to be reduced. And if you're cutting down the number of people who are coming in, taxing them, people not spending so much, what happens is those tracks, about half the tracks that have tote, they can't afford it any longer. And so they begin to contract or close. So there were more restrictions financially after the war, which made it more difficult.
So it sounds like greyhound racing was really Britain's first working class leisure activity. So how unusual is it for a form of popular entertainment from the 1920s to still be taking place recognisably today?
Well, in the 20s and 30s, greyhound racing was at one time the second most popular leisure gambling pursuit. The third for a time was the football pools, eventually they reversed. Basically sports move on. And with the football pools, that lasted a lot longer. National Lottery killed that off for a variety of reasons, so I could lecture on that forever. But with greyhound racing, it was never more than 4% or so of the working class. There were commissions. There's a Royal Commission in 1949 to 51. A chap called Alan Ginsberg produces a report and points out that, out of 30 odd million attendances, 32 million, 16 million are 200,000 people going regularly. And all the other million who attend only go once a week, once a month, or once a year. So really, in a sense, it was always a niche, and I think that's the point. Other sporting activities come and go. I don't think, when Wimbledon was closed down, the groundsman said, I think greyhound racing will get dead in 20 years. That was 2017. I don't think he's right. Another point, which we sometimes forget, every so often you get dogs that are legendary. And I think there's that element of following that. If you go on what helped to stimulate greyhound racing in the 20s was Entry Bridge, the daughter of Hopsack, which was a coursing dog, that won the first greyhound derby. And then a year or two later, twice running, was Mick the Miller. These dogs, I think every so often you get a dog that becomes the sort of champion.
Even though there was a lot of working class connections with greyhound racing, there was royalty and celebrity and glamour around greyhound racing too. So who are some of the more surprising figures associated with greyhound racing?
Well, I suppose the most obvious, because you had had a dog was the Queen Mother. She was the mother stuff as well. But many celebrities of the day, names I could mention 1 or 2 names, but it wouldn't mean anything to you. But these are the celebrities of the day had greyhounds. But I think there was a fashion in the 20s and 30s, particularly, to own a dog. Most dogs, of course, weren't owned by celebrities. They were owned by until the 50s, they were owned by the company. They used to buy in from Ireland, dogs in from Ireland, train them at their own establishments and run them in their own races. And you used to have a lot of people. Up the street when I was raised, there was a bloke who trained his own dogs, but he could never get into the major races because it was the flapping races he did it, and so forth. So he never got in there. But there were a few celebrities. I think, if I remember correctly, didn't the Aga Khan actually, apart from owning horses, own dogs as well? I'm sure the Aga Khan did as well.
Do you think there's a tendency to overlook the historical importance of popular and working class culture compared to other forms of heritage?
There's always that element, because basically the attitude until the 1940s, National Anti-Gambling League eventually expired, was that in fact, working class should not be gambling because they can't afford it. And they tried to play it down. Whilst the middle class, of course, indulged, and the aristocracy indulged as they wished. Certain hypocrisy there, and Harold Macmillan said, we must sort out this tangled web, I think his phrase was.
So what makes something part of a country's cultural heritage rather than just simply an old form of entertainment?
Well, I think it's acceptance, isn't it? Basically, I mean, every event that ever occurred in terms of leisure is acceptance of a group who are going to develop that, and that becomes part of your culture. I mean, we're raised on lots of ideas. I mean, to me, that my big culture really, when I was younger, was my family were always regularly checked the pools. It had to be in by Friday, Saturday. The results at 4:45. You're getting 4:45, 4:50. You're getting the football results. Then you're going out for the green and the pink and that verifies that these are the results and whatever. And then you run and get some money the following week. It becomes part of. It's accepted by the community. Now I think with greyhound racing, it's not quite the same, but it is a cultural feature. And also, you've got to remember that if you were in areas like Manchester, London or Glasgow, these are the main centres, but there are others throughout the country, it's employment. It becomes part of what you... I mean, greyhound racing, it's really difficult to take figures there other than the National Greyhound Racing Society, and that's sort of part of it. But I think the estimate is something like 2,500 jobs permanently available in about 1934, and about 5,000 or 6,000 part-time. By the 1940s, after the Second World War, you're talking at least 5,000 permanent jobs and 25,000 part-time jobs. Now it becomes accepted within the community. You're part and parcel of that system. And the part-timers might be, although they have to get permission, might be clerks in banks. I mean, if you're actually wanting people to calculate how much money people have earned and that, and all the finance part, you need somebody that knows about money. Inland Revenue people, the Inland Revenue didn't take action to restrict the opportunity of their clerks to work there, but it becomes part of that community. And really, in a sense, there would be actually days connected with that community, particular races associated with that community. So it becomes part of the employment structure, it becomes part of the community, it's handed down. There are people who've never been to greyhound meetings who complained of the closure of Bellevue. You know, I've never been, but, you know, it's part of what I was raised with. So it becomes part of that community.